This will be my final public writing on Trayvon Martin-George Zimmerman. There are two parts. Number one, at the end of the day, this case is about individual people with individual families and individual lives and destinies. At the end of the day, it boils down to terrifying moments for two men and the lingering pain that both of their families will endure. Make no mistake, the pain of the Zimmermans family pales in comparison with what Trayvon's family has and will endure. Even if George goes to prison for 30, 40, 50 years, which, as I covered earlier, he most likely will not, there is no comparison to losing a son to death. Both George's and Trayvon's families can visit their loved ones on Christmas. Both families can write letters and cards telling them how much they are missed. Both families can celebrate birthdays and holidays. Both families can talk to their loved ones and etc. Let's be clear though, only George's family gets to see his smile, hear his voice in return, or gets a letter in reply. Both families are devastated, but one exponentially more than the other. And where do we lay the blame of this? Even if we take George's story for what it is and decide that it is the entire truth, who do we hold responsible for this death? Let's just play it out under the assumption that George's version is the correct one. If George hadn't pulled the trigger, Trayvon wouldn't be dead. If Trayvon hadn't been beating George on the ground, the trigger would not have never been pulled. If Trayvon had not attacked George behind that house, George wouldn't have been being beaten. If George hadn't been looking for Trayvon on the side of that house, Trayvon would not have attacked him. If Trayvon had not run away, George would not have been looking for him. If Trayvon hadn't felt like he was being followed, he would not have run away. If Trayvon didn't look suspicious, George would not have followed him. And if Trayvon didn't have Skittles, a canned tea, and a hoodie, he wouldn't have looked suspicious. It's in this last point that this whole tragedy breaks down. This young man did nothing wrong except look wrong in the mind of the wrong person. If you look at the facts above as George has loosely stated them to be, it actually looks like Trayvon should have been the one to get off with a self-defense claim. A non-uniformed, non-authority person is following him at night for no reason. How was Trayvon supposed to know if this man was friend or foe? If, as it has been said, George lost sight of Trayvon and was later blindsided by him in an attack, who can blame Trayvon? Instinct takes over. I'm pursued, I'm afraid, I hide and think I'm safe. My pursuer is turning around and coming back towards my hiding spot that he passed earlier. It's now fight or flight. My flight to this point hasn't worked. I fight not to flee again, but until I feel the threat is neutralized. If it was, in fact, George screaming on those calls, it was because a fearful, desperate man was attacking him. In that moment, both men were in a fight for their lives. The one with the gun prevailed. But would that fight, that moment, have ever occurred if George hadn't brought the fight to Trayvon? Among the darkest questions is whether George would have even walked in the dark if he did not have that gun. When you know you have a gun, however, you step into danger more boldly because you know you are ready for whatever may happen. Trayvon got the jump on George, according to George, but Trayvon wasn't equipped for the type of fight George was prepared for. Trayvon wasn't aware that there could have been this type of danger that night, so he didn't prepare for it. George was obviously aware that there could have been danger, and was comfortable enough that he could handle whatever would arise. Clearly, if the story is as we have heard George said it was, the blood on this ground belongs at the feet of George. He is not law enforcement. He had no authority to stop or pursue. He can only observe and report. Whatever legal technicality may be holding this up should not be confused with the burden of who had the greatest ability to prevent this death from happening. That person is clearly George. He would have had no self to defend if he hadn't gone after that boy. Sure, Trayvon could have frozen to wait to see if the man pursuing him had good or bad intentions, but Trayvon should not have had to wait to see. If stand your ground applies to anyone in this case, it must apply to the recipient of the contact and the pursuit. The pursued should have first right to make a stand. When Trayvon made his stand, he was the first one fighting for his life, not George. What was he supposed to do? Lay on the ground, put his hands behind his back? For what? For who? Police? A teacher? A parent? No. He was asked to stop by a total stranger, one who was pursuing him for no reason. I would have told my son to run too. And if my son felt cornered, like there was no way out, I would have told him to fight for his life. Scratch, bite, scream, claw, punch, fight. According to Zimmerman, that's how Trayvon jumped on him, like a man out of control. This should have never happened. George, the adult with the gun, and the police on the phone and on the way, had the last chance to prevent the situation from reaching this level, and he didn't. Period. And the hearts of our nation should grieve for this crime and this family. Number 2. I have learned something about myself in this situation. My passion and part of my assignment is to combat the inequities in our nation in the area of race. You will have to see previous posts for a silver of my thoughts on the matter, but it is something that I meditate on daily. I have done so for years because I abide mentally and spiritually in this swirling world of systemic evil all of the time. I get grieved when I see the misdirection that unfortunate situations like this tend to cause. These situations are merely blips on the radar screen of the racial evils that exist in our nation. Unfortunately, they are the ones that get the press and passion, while the great ongoing horrors are seldom even acknowledged by the masses. The furor over the Trayvon Martin slaying needs to be pared back and examined closely. If we say that all of this commotion is because of our outrage over the useless death of a black teenager, we are deceived. If we say we are upset that he was killed in so brutal a manner and so unfairly, we are deceived. If we say we are passionate because we can't bear the thought of what that mother and father must be going through, just thinking of the last moments of their child's life, we are deceived. If any of these are the core of our focus, then this case reveals our national hypocrisy in ways that no sermon could ever could. If it were these things that sparked such national outrage, then we would protest every day of every year in every state in America, for all of the above take place on a daily basis. No, the outrage in this case is because of the lack of justice. It should not matter to us that the killer is Hispanic, brown, Latino, and seems to have gotten away with it. If Zimmerman were black, white, or any other race, we should have shown the same outrage. Likewise for Trayvon had he been any other race. My problem with situations like this is that though they are so infrequent and so rare, they get the national passion. If a white man commits a crime and gets off, or a black man doesn't commit a crime and gets punished, people take to the streets and the press, and they should. The disturbing part to me, however, is that these tragic occurrences are less than 1% of the inequity that occurs in our nation every year. The 99% barely gets a raised eyebrow. We have become so used to it that it chugs along like it is actually normal. These two things, whites getting away with crimes they did and blacks paying for crimes they didn't do, have their place in our overall objective of ending racism. When you look at the whole problem, however, you will see that they are two tiny specks in a huge mire of a tilted society. Crime, murder, drugs, AIDS, education, infant mortality, and so on are all majorly out of balance on the race spectrum. There is a veritable holocaust in our nation of black young men dying. My city led our state for years in this category. A report on murder in the city of New Orleans was recently released that said of the 200 homicides in a 13-month period, 91% of the victims were black. The list of cities with unacceptable statistics like these goes on and on. It is these larger, more common issues of race in our nation that occupy my heart. My wife and close friends hear about it too much for me. When I hear of issues like Trayvon, my tail starts to wag like a dog because I think that this may be the thing that gets us to tackle the problem. Instead, we get sidetracked with the sideshow, headlines, marches, FB, Facebook posts. Then back to normal. People go back to their lives while I sit in my room and grieve over the mill wheel of pain that keeps turning and turning in our nation. Consider this. How many Americans have died in our country in acts of terrorism in the last 15 years? There is a number to that. How many black males have been killed by gunshot in our country in the same time frame? There is a number to that. Which do you think is greater? Ask the same question about these for the last 20, 30, 40 years. Which do you think is greater? How many young black males have been killed by gunshot for no reason since the night Trayvon was killed? It's been 30 days. Does anyone know the number? Does anyone but the investigators and the victims, families, friends, even know their names? Well, Pastor, the difference in the Trayvon case is that it was a hate crime. First off, I don't know of any killing taking place in our streets that is not a hate crime. They certainly aren't love crimes. Secondly, make no mistake, Trayvon was not killed because he was black. His blackness was certainly a factor in why it happened the way it happened, but not in the same way as James Anderson. Mr. Anderson was killed because he was black. Trayvon was killed because a man was stupid, foolish, and blinded by prejudices he may not have ever admitted to himself that he had. There is a difference, negligible as it may be to the victims or their families. Sadly, the slaying of Mr. Anderson is actually easier to put into our logic boxes than Trayvon's. Clear, intentional hate we can compartmentalize and isolate. What happened with Mr. Zimmerman is less easy to isolate and comprehend. Now, to my recent revelation about myself. Deep in the grass in that Sanford neighborhood, the blood of Trayvon Martin calls out to God. It calls out like the blood of Abel. The Hebrew origin of the word blood in Genesis 4 is actually plural. God said, "Your brother's bloods cry out to me." God was speaking in terms of Abel's generation, which were slain when he was. The Talmud teaches that whoever saves or takes a life saves or kills the entire world. That is what happened in Sanford. It is what happens every time blood is pointlessly shed. The bloods of every murdered person of every race cry out from the ground. I have realized just today that I can hear it. For some reason, I can hear it. Like the telltale heart, it cries out to me. I don't want to hear it. I don't even want to care. These things are not my fight and not my battle. What's more, I endure such torment, spiritual opposition, and grief in every move I make to combat it. I don't even want to touch it. I try to turn it off. I smash it down, cover my head, turn my back, turn up the noise. Nothing works. The screaming never stops. The cries keep coming in my ears. If you want to know why I have written over 20 pages on Facebook on this subject, now you know. It gushes in me constantly, and what I've shared here doesn't even scratch the surface. My wife has heard the most. A few others know a little piece. I live in it all the time. This doesn't make me special or commendable. It makes me sad and alone. I feel like I hear dead people, but they don't know that they are dead and they want me to help. But God hasn't shown me how. To me, that's not a line from a movie. It's the story of my life, at least for the last 25 years. That's it. My writings publicly on this case are closed. I'm gone till November. That is, unless I win the $640 million jackpot. Then you may not hear from me again unless they have Facebook in Barbados. Just kidding. Kind of. Oh, and again, please don't bring any negativity to my page. This is my page, not an opinion forum. If you are that bothered by what I say, don't read it or just delete me. My buddy has a t-shirt to help motivate you if you need it. It has certainly helped me. Good night.